Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We have Dr. Tim Pawl joining us today. First time on the show. Wonderful beard. I'm kind of embarrassed by mine at this point. We have the form of the beard is here, and we're going to talk about the Incarnation. Dr. Pawl has done some really cool and interesting work on the Incarnation. I don't think we've ever actually even covered this before in the podcast, so I know this episode will be of interest to many listeners. So, Dr. Pawl, thanks so much for taking time to be here. It's a really a joy to connect with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invite. I look forward to chatting about the Incarnation.
So this is your first time on the show, so probably we should do some of the usual formalities. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Pawl, who are you? How'd you get into philosophy? And even more specifically, how'd you get into being interested in the philosophical puzzles of the Incarnation and all that good stuff?
Sure, yeah. Let me think. So I'm Tim Pawl. I teach at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. I've been here since 2008. In that time, I've also been on fellowships at Notre Dame and at St. Andrews in Scotland. I got interested in philosophy when I was little. I remember being interested in these sorts of things as long as I remember anything. Like, is there a God? Will I see my beloved dead after life? Could I? Is it possible? And so I've always been interested in that sort of thing. When I went to college, I had made a couple blunders, and one blunder was this. This is my 18-year-old sagely wisdom. I thought that I had discovered something new, and it was that all religions say the very same thing, just with different words.
I discovered that idea too at one point.
Did you really?
Yeah. Amazing. We're like, yeah, that's great. We're like Leibniz and Newton or something, right?
Yeah, I was like, wait a second. I discovered this sort of a priori. I didn't even study Buddhism to see. This got to be this way.
Right.
And so that was one of the blunders. A second blunder is the definitions of religious studies and theology. So I had them basically swapped. I thought that theology studied all religions and their interrelations, and I thought religious studies just picked a religion and studied it. So I was looking at schools, and I was ruling out any school that did religious studies because I misunderstood it. I was like, I don't want to go study the Bible. I want to look at all the religions and how they compare. So I went to a school named Valparaiso University in Indiana. It's a little Lutheran school, and I discovered two immediate disappointments. One was, oh shoot, they do theology, and that means theology. Like there's a lot of Bible stuff going on here, which was an immediate disappointment. But in retrospect, I love it. I think it's wonderful. Those Lutherans gave me a real love for Scripture, and it's a blessing. And the second was, I actually did a little scratching and studying other religions, and my own religion more deeply too. I wasn't really a very good Christian at the time. And I was like, well, gosh, they don't say the same thing at all. These are explicitly contradictory. So it can't be the case that I'm reincarnated and not, or that Christ is God and not. And so, well, that was two bummers in a row. But I found philosophy while I was there and took a logic class and fell in love with that. And I thought, oh, this is the sort of stuff I want to do. This makes my heart go pitter patter. And so I took that to primarily theological questions like the ones I had previously. And ever since, I've just been doing that sort of thing. Went to graduate school for it. I studied with Eleanor Stump at St. Louis University.
Yeah.
Met a wife. A wife, as if I had more than one. My one wife there. And I've been happy ever after.
Yeah, wow, beautiful story. A lot of actual stuff I want to poke out there. It's funny you mentioned Dr. Stump. Big fan of her work, and I've got her book right next to the one I was looking at with yours, Wandering in Darkness, right here. Sorry, the virtual background's kind of blocking that. But yeah, that's cool. I had no idea that you actually studied under Dr. Stump. That's very neat. But not entirely surprising. Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned the whole religious pluralism thing, because I guess geniuses with a capital J think alike and discover the same things, right? And I indeed discovered that as well. And then it's kind of funny because you have this sort of naive view of religious pluralism. Oh, religions just literally say the same thing, which you take 5 minutes, you realize that that's just definitely not the case, right? And then I guess there's this sort of somewhat more sophisticated view of like, okay, all religions, they're definitely saying different things, but they're all groping towards sort of the same idea of transcendence. they're all false, right? They're all false, but they're groping towards something in a sort of the best way that they can, right?
Yeah.
So just pick whatever one does it for you, right? Did you ever go in for that more sophisticated version at all, or did you just kind of just abandon religious pluralism, once you started taking a more serious look?
Yeah, I never went for that one. I've never been keen on acts of worship where I think it's false. What I have to say out loud as if I think it's true.
Yeah.
And on the way you just described that sort of pluralism, that's what I'd have to be doing. Is if I say a creed, I'm like, well, this is all actually BS. But yeah, the sun died, and I've always thought, for me, I just couldn't square it. I couldn't
Yeah.
square it as a thing I'd want to do.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there, and I think that I guess there's a very good case to be made for Christianity as well. I think it was I'm probably going to get this wrong, but it was I think it was like Fulton Sheen who said it's either Catholicism or atheism. He was even more explicit than that, right? And maybe that's a false quote, but let's just say it's not. But then there was C.S. Lewis who said it's either Christianity or Hinduism, right?
That's right. I was thinking that too.
Yeah. And I actually think Lewis is a better case, right? Like, to me, like, if for whatever reason I just came to think that Christianity, Catholicism was false, like, I wouldn't go back to be an atheist. That's where I came from, right? Like, it just seems like, no, I wouldn't do that. I would probably take another look at that broad religious pluralism. But like you, I wouldn't adopt any specific creed. I guess I don't know. Sorry, this is not related to our topic, but it
No,
just
it's great.
popped into
It's
my
fun.
head. Any thoughts you have on that? I'd be curious, right?
Yeah. No, I think I would too. Like, if suppose God opened up my ceiling right now and he said, "Yo, you're wrong about," where is he? That guy. That's wrong. I'd go back to the drawing board, but I probably wouldn't end up back in atheism, because a lot of the cumulative case you have for a sort of theism, for Catholicism in general, or Christianity in general, will work quite nice as a cumulative case, or part of a cumulative case, for any other sort of monotheistic religion, at least.
Yeah.
So, objectivity of morality, meaning of life, lots of things, first cause style arguments that can all point in lots of directions. They don't always get you to that guy. Sorry, I keep pointing the wrong shoulder. It's
I know, it's all
in
reversed.
the real world. It's behind me. Well, I can't even show you behind. I guess it should be over here if it were like the real world.
Yeah.
But it looks like it's over there.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Okay. Well, that's all fun preamble, and it is fun. But let's turn towards the Incarnation now. You've done a lot of work on this. You've got a really good, very thick book offering a defense of and maybe we should start there, right? Of what is the usefulness of a defense, and how modest this project is, because in your book on conciliar Christology, you say, look, I'm not here to prove to you that this is true. I'm just trying to prove to you, hopefully, that nobody has proven that it's false, right?
That's right.
And sometimes people might hear that and it might be a little bit disappointed, but that's actually a really useful project for a lot of reasons. So maybe you could talk about what the nature of a defense is, why you think it's valuable, and then why you wanted to undertake a defense of the Incarnation.
Yeah. Oof, those are good. So Aquinas draws a distinction, and I like this distinction, between mysteries in a strict sense and a non-strict sense. And a mystery, he says, in a strict sense, is something that you can't show through reason alone is true, and you can't even show it's possible that it's true through reason alone.
Yeah.
And he thinks that things like dogmas of the Trinity and the Incarnation fall under the strict sense of mystery. And he says, don't even try to argue for these things. He says it'll cause the unbelievers to scoff at you. They'll say, you believe in the Trinity for this dopey 6 premise argument? That's what you got for me?
Right, yeah.
And when I hear that, I think, well, yeah, I mean, that strikes me as right. I don't have a good even 7 premise argument that's just reason alone for the Trinity. I'm aware of some, like there's arguments from Love that
Swinburne's and stuff, yeah. But I'm with you. I don't totally go in for it. Yeah.
So I think, I don't see a good reason from reason alone, or an argument from reason alone, for the truth of the Incarnation, and I don't really expect to. It doesn't make me upset that there isn't such a thing. What can I do? Well, there are lots of fair-minded people who really want to know the truth and who think themselves to have sound arguments against the Incarnation. Arguments about things like, God can't be tempted, but Christ was tempted, so Christ isn't God. And if he's not God, then he can't be God incarnate. So he's not God incarnate. And I think those sort of people who are fair-minded and giving a charitable argument and trying to seek the truth, someone should be talking back with them.
Yeah.
And the talking with them shouldn't be in the form of, grumpy rhetoric. It should be, your second premise, whichever, or whatever. This premise is false and here's why, or you've equivocated and really you're using the term two different ways and that makes the argument unsound. But it should be something like that. Someone should do it. I don't think everybody should do it, but at least one guy out there should be doing it. and I call
and here he is. Yeah,
yeah, I'll do that.
Right. Yeah, no, that's excellent, right? So you might think, okay, maybe I can't give it even a non-dopey sixth premise argument for the incarnation, but maybe I have other good reasons to think that it's true. Maybe I think that it's revealed, for example. Okay,
sure,
great, cool. But people are claiming that it's incoherent or contradictory or something like that. So that's where a defense comes in, right?
Yeah.
And to show, no, you haven't quite shown that, so I'll just keep on going with it, believing in it, sort of thing, right? And that is, of course, I think a very valuable project, and I'm glad we have at least one guy doing it, doing good work in there. So cool. All right, well, let's get into it now then. So the incarnation, we should probably just do some of the basics there. What are we committed to with the doctrine of the incarnation, and then we can start to see what sort of puzzles come out of it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think when I typically talk about it, I talk about what I call conciliar Christology. And by that, I just mean the Christology, the teachings about Christ that you find in the, pardon me, the very earliest Christian councils. So like the Council of Nicaea, where we get the Nicene Creed from in 325 AD. That was the first of these ecumenical councils where lots of bishops came together and ruled on matters of doctrine. You look in Acts 15, you'll find the apostles getting together and making rulings on doctrine, like don't be sexually immoral and don't eat food that was strangled and don't eat blood. And other than that, you guys are good to go. That sort of thing. You don't have to follow the whole law. And they say things like, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit to teach this. So for Catholics and for the Orthodox, we think that sort of thing, meetings where the Holy Spirit somehow ratifies what's being taught, that continued for centuries. And the first 7 of those meetings are accepted by both the Orthodox and the Catholics as being universally, unrevisably true. They're taught by God. So what's in them? I focus on those just because they've got the largest consensus, East and West, and across time and across the centuries. Very many, say, Lutherans would be remiss to say I deny the Christology taught in those early councils. So focus on those. They teach us that there's one person, the divine person, the Word, one of the 3 blessed in the Blessed Trinity. The divine person, the Word, took onto himself, the technical language is assumed, but he took on a human nature. And by a human nature, I mean a concrete composite of flesh and blood, of body and soul, a thing a lot like this thing. Took it on himself. And so when that thing was struck, it was the Word. It was God being struck, because that thing is in the Word.
Right.
Just like, you put a hole through this and you pierce Tim Pawl. You put a hole through Christ's blessed hand, you pierce the Word. You pierce the person of the Word. So that's the teaching. There's a lot more that goes into it. Like, what is that nature like? And did it have its own, you might think, will or intellect? Did it, it had a brain. Was it functioning like your or my brain? Those are the sort of questions they ask too. So that's the general teaching of the incarnation.
Yeah, great. Very helpful. Very clear. Okay, so obviously, almost immediately, it starts to raise a host of questions. And sort of in the background, I think this is important, at least for Catholics, but yeah, probably most Christian, I don't even know anymore. But we'll just say for Catholics, is this sort of metaphysics of classical theism, right? And that's where we're going to have to try and work things out, right? So we're committed to this picture of God that comes along with things like divine simplicity and immutability and okay, and now we've got this whole incarnation thing going on. So we got a puzzle here. We got to start to fit this stuff together. So Dr. Pawl, what I'd like you to do, obviously we cannot cover everything, and this is why you wrote a lot on this subject. But what do you think are some of the sort of more interesting initial challenges or puzzles that sort of immediately crop up from the philosophical perspective with the incarnation? Maybe we could just start working through some of those. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Here's one that Richard Cross, some time ago, Richard Cross is a contemporary philosopher at Notre Dame. He called it the fundamental philosophical problem of the incarnation.
Yeah.
And I think he's right. That's a good title for what I'm about to tell you.
Mhm.
So it goes like this. You put it a lot of different ways. Here's the way I put it. But anything divine has the following feature. So it could be, if to go with the features you gave us, anything divine is simple, or anything divine is immutable, or anything divine is omniscient or omnipotent. Take all the fancy divine prerogatives,
Yeah.
being those ways. Anything divine has those.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, anything that's human lacks those. So any human like me or you, we're contingent. We didn't have to exist, so we're not necessary. And we're ignorant of some things. You don't know my mom's maiden name, so you're ignorant of some things, so you're not omniscient, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So now we've got all divine things are this way, and all human things are not that way. Once you add in the Christological claim that Christ is both divine and human, you get in a mess, right? Because from that first premise that anything divine is this way, you can derive Christ is that way.
Mm-hmm.
And from the second claim, anything human is not that way, you can derive Christ is not that way. And so you have one person being both that way, impassible, say, and passable, immutable and mutable. And that's a contradiction.
Right.
Since no contradictions are true, something went amiss, and we only started with three premises. Divine things are this way, and human things are that way, and nothing can be both ways. So one of those three claims has to go out the window. And the question is, which one and why?
Yeah, unless I guess you don't go with Dr. Beale's. I'm with you. I'm with you on that, by the way. And I think you're going to try and show that we don't have to go that way, right? Okay,
right.
yeah. So I think the problem's pretty obvious, right? Yeah. If you think that contradictions are impossible, it seems like we just got ourselves into maybe a whole pile of contradictions, right?
Yeah.
How do we get out of it? What's the solution? Is there a fundamental solution to the fundamental problem? Do you think, Dr. Pawl? Mm-hmm.
I think there is. So I think I'll give you a couple false starts, in my estimation, false starts.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So I gave you those three premises. All divine things are this way. All human things aren't that way. And nothing can be both that way and not that way. That first premise, all divine things are this way. Some people deny that for a lot of the divine prerogatives. So, many contemporary philosophers will say, well, God's not really simple, or God's not really immutable, or take your pick. The general principle here is, if you make yourself a chart where you have, or a table where you have like a divine column and a human column, and you have all the features underneath that seem contradictory.
Yep.
For every row of that, you take one and pluck it off. So you say, well, simple and composite, Christ isn't simple. But omniscient and not omniscient, Christ is omniscient. And, omnipotence and not omnipotent, you take your pick. Each place you take your pick. So you're never stuck anywhere saying he's both.
Right. Yeah.
Now, you could do that sort of thing, and people have made a good case of it, but I think there's a huge problem trying to do that. And the problem comes up for anybody who's trying to stay within the bounds of what I've called conciliar Christology. And the problem is those darn councils will say things like, and here's a quote, or a close paraphrase, because I don't have the text in front of me. They say, one and the same Christ is, and you take a deep breath, and they say, one and the same Christ is passible and impassible, mutable and immutable, expressible in writing and non-expressible in writing. They give 5 in a row. 5 of these apparent.
They are pesky little councils.
Those pesky, man.
Good job.
I read that, and I'm like, put my head on my desk. Oh my gosh!
Are you gonna make my job this much more difficult?
There's no way to do it. So that was a rough day.
Well, that's it's funny because your project of staying within the councils is helpful because my first line of thought is just like, well, dang, it just seems like it's classical theism or bust. So it's like from the philosophical perspective, I got to reconcile these things. But just looking within the councils, this is what we're committed to, right?
Yeah.
And at least for a lot of your audience, they probably don't want to give that up, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Most, what to say? Most folks don't want to give it up, and those who do want to give it up are still like they're reticent about it. They'd much rather be in the tradition of consensus throughout all of Christian history.
Right.
You know, that it's, I think most Christians have like a default at least. I'd rather agree with what all those guys back then thought in all those different places than
Yeah.
not.
Hmm.
And I think that's a sensible place to be. I mean, if you think of how rife with intrigue, political intrigue, those early councils were and those early bishops were to each other. Um, I mean, if you made a movie called Bishops Behaving Badly and just had them do the things they did, like sending prostitutes to one another's rooms in the
Right.
hopes of getting a guy kicked out of the council by being caught red-handed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
If you just make a movie of all that stuff, the people in the studio would be like, "Man, tone it down. This it couldn't have happened like
Too
this.
much.
Like,
Not.
make it closer to
It's
reality.
too much for today's
This,
culture, right?
this
Yeah.
is too much. This it couldn't have been this way," and it was. It was
Right.
bonkers.
Uh-huh.
So, but if you think about all the political intrigue, and then you think about how quick they were to try to charge each other with heresy,
Hmm.
and yet they could all come together and affirm Christ is impassible, which they did. I mean, it's very improbable that the very same heresy would rise up at all the universal sees, like in Constantinople and in Antioch and in Alexandria and in Rome. It's very unlikely you'd have the very same heresy rise up everywhere, and then all the council fathers get together and then pronounce it.
Right.
Very likely it would rise up one place, and then they'd all get together and stomp the dude for saying it. And they take away his see, and they'd split some of his money, and they political intrigue. But it never happened. So the fact that you have these universal teachings where it's a Christian consensus of the world, they come together and teach the same thing. I think that's very strong evidence that it's something that they received from the deposit of faith, something they received very early.
Yeah.
And so I think most people think something like that. And so they're reticent to give up the consensus teaching of the very early church.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good response. Okay, so false start. Probably don't want to just start
Right.
scratching off, some of the traditional divine attributes. Not only because you might think that there's some good philosophical motivation there, but it just seems like the council commits you to them, anyways. Right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right.
Cool.
Good.
All right.
Good.
Mhm.
So what to do instead? Well, pardon me. The move I like to make is a move where you target not that first premise or the second premise, the one that says all divine things are this way, all human things are that way.
Mhm.
But I want to target that third one, which seems like the most safe one. Seems like the one you don't want to target,
Mhm.
the one that says nothing can be both. And so I want to take a test case, like I typically use passibility. So
Mhm.
that's one of the ones they say in that quotation that I gave you earlier of 5 apparently contradictory claims in a row.
Mhm.
So Christ is passible, and the very same Christ is impassible. How do you make sense of that conundrum? I think, well, it can't be the case then that they're really contradictory features. These guys are no slouches. They say it in a single sentence. The very same Christ is both passible and impassible. What are they up to?
Mhm.
Well, I think they probably didn't understand it as contradictory. But then how did they understand it? Well, here's how I think we could understand it. Let me give you an analogy first, and then I'll work back to where we are.
Great.
So the analogy, I've published this sort of thing elsewhere, but imagine a situation in which everybody in the whole society is only single-armed. They've got just one arm.
Mhm.
And they only ever met people with just one arm. And they've got a bunch of words they use about people with arms. So they've got a word, call it arm bent. And they just stipulate your arm bent. When your arm is bent, can you see my arm? More than 90 degrees. So
Yep.
that's someone arm bent.
Mhm.
And then you've got arm unbent, and you've got that true of somebody when they have an arm that's not bent more than 90 degrees, just straight.
Sure.
Okay. In that sort of situation, in that world of one-armed people, no one could ever be both arm bent and arm unbent. Because
Mhm.
if you only have one arm, it can't be both at a more than 90-degree angle and not at a more than 90-degree angle. That one arm only does, one or the other, but not both of those things.
Right.
So it makes sense that people in that society would think these terms are contradictories. It can't be both.
Mhm.
But once you add a second arm, once you have someone with two arms visit the society, then that person can do the thing where you have one arm, up and down and the other one out. You can't see, I don't think, but they can have one arm bent and the other one straight. And in doing so, they can satisfy the conditions for both being arm bent and arm unbent.
Yes.
The moral is, if you add another thing in virtue of which these predications can be satisfied,
Mhm.
a second arm, you can say one thing is both. Now, how does it apply to the incarnational case? I think like this. What does it mean to be impassible? It could just mean unable to change no matter what period. Maybe that's what impassible means.
Right.
But of course, if they meant that, they never would have said he's both. If they meant unable to change no matter what period, or unable to be causally affected no matter what period, they wouldn't have said Christ is that, because they believed and had just confessed that he suffered, died, and was buried. And that surely is being causally affected. In fact, in the Latin, it's passus est. You know, he suffered. So
Right.
so they would never have said that. That can't be what they meant. What if they meant instead he has a nature according to which he can suffer? So according to which he cannot suffer. So you're impassible when you have a nature according to which you cannot suffer, and you're passible when you have a nature that can suffer, a nature through which you can suffer. I think that's what they meant. And notice, if that's what they meant, then any of us normal humans walking around, we're like people in the one-arm society. We've only ever seen things with one arm, so we think you can't be both arm bent and arm unbent.
Right.
But you get Christ, you get the visitor with two arms, and you think, dang, that guy can be arm bent and arm unbent. Or dang, that guy can be causally affected through this nature and not causally affected through that nature. So I guess he satisfies both conditions. He's passible and impassible.
Yeah.
So I like that sort of move.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I do too. I do like that sort of move. And how much, what do you think are the commitments in terms of background metaphysics to make these sort of moves work? Are you committed to a broadly Thomistic carving up of reality, Aristotelian? Do you think you could do these sort of moves if you aren't, a broad Aristotelian? Those are interesting questions to think about. Realist, right? Do you have to be a realist? Could a nominalist go in for this sort of thing? How much, I guess, how much flexibility does your solution have is, I guess, the question I'm asking. Yeah, right.
That's good. So let me think, what do I need for it to work? I do need there to be real natures there, because I have to say it has a nature such that blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So just like you need real arms in the arm case, no fair if you have a guy visit with only one arm, but then something else that we call an arm. It's got to actually be an arm there to satisfy the conditions. Now, what we say of that nature, like if we say it's purely material, for instance, you could say the human nature is purely material and have the same sort of answer I just gave. I think if you say that, if you say it's purely material, you've got problems elsewhere to address.
Sure.
But just the sort of has a nature that yada, yada, yada move doesn't require an immaterial aspect. It doesn't, you can go the other way. You can be a pure dualist too, I suppose. And you could use the same sort of mechanics I just gave.
Yeah.
But again, I think if you're a pure dualist, I think that's problems with the councils as well.
Sure.
So the councils, I think, require a lot more than just the mechanics of the cheerleader analogy or the one-armed person analogy requires.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe some flexibility, but maybe not a huge amount either. At least if you're going to have everything ultimately hang together, right? And that's sort of what we want. We want that nice coherence. Very good. Okay. So yeah, that seems like a sort of a neat way out, right? Of saying, hey, maybe there's another thing here, right? And that's exactly what the incarnation is about. One person, two natures. Cool. So we can say, it's not, Christ is not, mutable and immutable in the same aspect, in the same respect, right? That's sort of what we're denying to get out of the contradictory charge, right? Is that the simple summary?
Yeah. There's the in the same respect. Sometimes people use the word qua for that. So qua man, he suffered; qua divine, he didn't suffer. And I think there's a lot of ways of understanding that qua. And I think the one I just gave you, where we say has a nature that's able to be causally affected, or has a nature that's not able to be causally affected, is one way of interpreting how that qua claim is supposed to work.
Yeah,
that's a fair thing to say. Yeah.
Okay, let's turn now to an interesting puzzle issue, and I guess this is just a general objection or puzzle that's been raised against classical theism, but finds it a specific instance with the incarnation. And the general puzzle is this. I'll lay it out for the audience, and we'll get a little bit more specific. it's kind of, how do you square contingency with necessity? Or even more specific than that, how do you square contingency with classical theism and its commitments, particularly simplicity and immutability and pure actuality? And one thing that we can focus on here is God's knowledge of creation. So for those who are unfamiliar, if you're a classical theist, you're committed to these broad notions of immutability, impassibility, necessity, pure actuality. Yet at the same time, we want to think that creation is contingent. It wasn't necessitated by the divine nature. And so we think that there's something that God knows, in virtue of bringing about creation, that presumably he might not have known if he did not bring about creation. So like on the surface, initially, it just seems like there might be change in God. We might, have activated some intrinsic passive potency or put a metaphysical accident in God, which the classical theist is saying, no, can't do that, not allowed. And again, that's a sort of general issue, but one could see how that might, pick up specifics with the incarnation, God knowing that he incarnated or did this or that while incarnated, stuff like that. I don't even know if I'm framing it the way you would like to frame it, Dr. Pawl. So why don't I kick it over to you? You can set it up however you want, and then we can start maybe thinking through this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think you framed it well. Hey, some people say, hey, if God is really, you have to start all objections with the word hey. I think it's just a law.
Hey, dude.
But
Hey, dude.
hey,
Yeah.
hey, dude, hey, slow down. Hey,
Yeah.
you just told me God is wholly simple. And by that, I presume you mean God, at least in his divinity, leave the incarnation aside for a moment here, God has no parts. When he becomes incarnate, the Son does gain parts. He's got a left hand and a right hand.
Yep.
But God, just in his divinity, he's got no parts, including metaphysical doodads. No metaphysical composition at all in God. Okay. And now you're saying he knows some contingent stuff. Like, even if he didn't create anything, he still knows at least one contingent truth. I didn't do nothing, is what he knows in that situation.
I ain't done nothing.
I've done nothing. So he's always got at least one contingent truth that he knows. How do you explain that without putting stuff in God? When I know things in virtue of something about something in me, maybe my brain or my soul or whatever, but there's some real change in me when I go from believing to not believing, or from not believing to believing. So why not with God? Okay, I take that to be the objection. And I think a good way to start answering it is to remember that in metaphysics, we're trying to find, we find ourselves faced with problems, and we're trying to find a way to resolve those problems. So one problem is, hey, how do we explain how something can go across time, changing some features it has? Like Pat sits now, but he stands later, then he sits again. How do we explain that? It can't be just the substance Pat that does the work, because that's their very same substance exists when he's standing and when he's sitting. And so it can't be the thing that explains why he's sitting now but standing later.
Right.
We need something new there. And we call those accidents or features or properties. So in metaphysics, you find a puzzle. You're like, how does this thing work? And then you try to make a solution for it, sometimes with a new entity, sometimes with a new principle.
Right.
Here with a new entity.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to do in the God case is try to strip out some of the motivation for adding a new entity there when God knows stuff. So why do I need a new entity in me whenever I start to know things? Well, part of it is, if it wasn't there, we wouldn't have a good explanation for how I go about knowing stuff. So an example, I now believe that you're sitting. I guess I don't know for sure. Maybe you slowly started squatting up.
Right. Kick the stool out from under. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you're sitting. And so I've got this belief. But one thing we know about my beliefs is that on occasion they're false. So I think you're sitting, but you're really standing. And on occasion, my beliefs are not only false, but I'm just ignorant. I'm agnostic. So sometimes I have a belief and it's wrong. Sometimes I have no belief at all. So Tim believes Pat is sitting. That claim, Tim believes Pat is sitting, isn't made true just by me existing and you existing in a sitting shape. Because sometimes I get it wrong. And probably earlier today you were sitting and I had no beliefs at all about whether you were sitting or not. So the main motivation I see for adding a sort of intrinsic thing in me to explain my beliefs is that I couldn't explain how reality is and get the right answers if I didn't have some intrinsic thing.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? Like earlier you were sitting and I didn't believe it. So just me existing and just you existing as sitting aren't sufficient for my having the belief.
That's
I
right.
need to add something else to reality to get sufficiency for my having the belief.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that's true of God. So the motivation I just laid out is to explain why sometimes I'm ignorant and sometimes I have false beliefs. We need something there besides just me and you to do the explaining. I don't think that's true of God. So God believes Pat is sitting. Does God ever labor under false beliefs? Does God ever labor under ignorance? I think no. So the main metaphysical motivation for adding an extra doodad in me when I believe stuff is my ignorance and my believing falsehoods. Now you can strip out that motivation from the divine case because of divine omniscience. He never has either of those two problems.
Mm-hmm.
So you're left with less of a reason to posit some extra stuff in God when he knows stuff. That's not a reason for thinking he doesn't have any extra stuff. But it is a reason for thinking you haven't yet shown me why I need to add another thing in God when he knows stuff.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You see that first step? It's
Yes.
a 1-2 punch. The first step is removing motivation for adding
Mm-hmm.
stuff to God. And that's what I tried to do just there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's good. It does remind me a bit of the extrinsic model that Dr. Grant develops. Would you say you're in that camp as well? Sort of taking an extrinsic model of knowledge with respect to God, right? That by which God, presumably, we take that God's knowledge is executive, right? When it comes to creation, right? Is
means what it's
executive. God knows that I'm sitting because God's causing me to sit, right?
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Versus, God passively receives it from me or something like that, right? Now that, of course, brings up other interesting questions and issues, but at least for this context. And that, right, that God's the act by virtue of which God causes or knows that is immutable, even though it might terminate or result in whatever it does, right? And it doesn't have to terminate or result in anything. Is that compatible with what you're saying? Do you think that's all sort of within the same school of thought there?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. That definitely seems like a very, at least, plausible solution to these issues. But again, I guess, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to show you, like, here's all how the mechanics work in fine detail, or we're just trying to show that the critic hasn't proven their case, right?
Yeah. So the critic hasn't proven it. I think that's what I was just trying to do just there. Like, the reason I believe in me having things like beliefs is for the reasons I gave earlier, and those don't apply to God. So you've yet to show me that I need to add those things. How could I make sense of his beliefs, God's beliefs, that is, without such things? I kind of think like this. So what's the ground in reality in virtue of which Pat is sitting is true? And it's whatever's going on over there. It's like maybe your substance, and maybe you have an accident in hearing in you. Maybe there's a platonic form that you're instantiating, some sort of metaphysical story for why it is that you're sitting. What's the metaphysical story for God knows that Pat is sitting? What makes that claim true? Well, I think I still need all the stuff that I had for Pat is sitting, however that story might go. Keep all that stuff there. I think I need God. God has to be in the picture for God to know stuff. Do I need a third thing? That is, I've got all the Pat stuff, Pat in his sitting accident, or Pat instantiating sittingness. I've got God existing. Do I need also like a relation or something, like a God's knowing relation to Pat? I don't think so. Do I need anything internal to him? Well, you haven't shown me that I do yet. And notice this, one thing we want to avoid is a regress in these sort of arguments. So for instance, here's an analogy. If I thought that everything that exists needs its own accident of existence, like an inhering form of existence in virtue of which it exists, and that nothing can play that role for itself, I'd have a pretty quick regress going, right? I exist, and so I have an inhering accident of existence. That thing exists. It can't play the role for itself. So it needs an inhering accident.
So it needs its own active existence and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So suddenly you're going in a regress. What you want to do in that sort of situation is nip it in the butt right away. You find the very first place you can say this thing exists and it doesn't need its own doodad added to it in order to exist. I think the first place to do it isn't with, if I had me and then I had the first act of existence. I think you could stop right there, but better to just stop right here. I don't need an accident of existence to explain it why it is that I exist. Just my being there is sufficient for it.
Yeah.
Go back to the God's knowledge case. So you have God, you've got Pat and his sitting accident. Do you need a relation there that's God's knowing the thing? Well, if you need another third real existing thing there, that relation, then we can ask of that thing. Like God knows about that too. Does he need another relation for that thing? And off we go on the regress again.
Right.
And again, the very same solution is stop it the first place you can. So you could trace it back and you can say you need Pat and his sitting accident, and you need the relation, and then you have God. You could say that, but I'd rather just get rid of the middleman, get rid of the thing that's binding them together. After all, if that thing can be known, if God's relation of knowing can be known by God without another thing, why can't I just say Pat is known without some third thing?
Yeah,
so that's what I want to say.
That's great. That's really interesting. And that's actually what you bring up is Barry Miller's objection against the correspondence theory of truth. He thinks that this is why that's false, because it leads you on this infinite regress of relation. So he's like, no, you should take a conformity theory of truth without that middleman doodad. And I always found that very correct, actually.
That sounds good.
But now I have to ask you about essay, right? Because this what you brought up is the essay of essay objection, right? Do we need this like string, this infinite pile of essays, right?
Yeah.
To have that first essay. So what is your position on a thing's needing an active existence? What would be the consequences for Aquinas's theory of the real distinction, which I think most people who are Thomistic friendly is sort of maybe running his principal argument for God. Do you think we can prevent the regress objection without losing what Aquinas is up to for his proofs? Just curious your quick thoughts on all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this, I got to look and make sure my doors are locked here and my windows are all closed. And I'm going to say it quietly because, there's always a Thomist lurking around somewhere.
Especially on this podcast. So get ready.
Oh, shoot. I'm not a particularly good Thomist on this point.
Yeah.
So I've never yet, tell me one if you have one, or your readers or viewers tell me one. I've never yet found a place where I have to pull out an active existence as an explanation for something important to what I'm trying to say. So I understand why I need a substantial form. I get that. I think those things exist. I understand why I need accidental forms. I can see a grounding and a thing to be explained, and that is an explainer. I don't see why I can't just use my substantial form again, have it do double duty for explaining the things the active existence is supposed to explain. So I've never yet found a reason to posit an active existence because it seems to me like all of its work can be done by the substantial form that a thing has.
Yeah. So I guess do you mind if we jam on this for a little bit? Because that's a really interesting point. I'm trying to jog my mind on Barry Miller's work again too, because I know he has some interesting things to say about this. But I know the first thing, which I'm sure you'll have a response to, because you thought about this, that Thomas would say is, well, what accounts for the actuality of the substantial form? Is it just a brute thing, or do we need some extra theoretical posit? And then I guess that you'll say, as soon as we add that theoretical posit, well, what accounts for that theoretical posit's actuality, right?
Yeah. Something has to be.
Right. Yeah. Sorry if I just ran the whole thing in a big circle, but yeah, please fill in whatever details you want. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the general principle is somewhere along the line, you're going to need a thing there, whatever it is, that can explain its own existence, or you're going to have an infinite regress. If you say, well, wait a second, God explains it. That's a different sort of explanation you're talking about there. Like, I grant that God is the first cause in the chain of explanation of things. But I don't see why it has to go God, essay, form, Tim, instead of just God, form, Tim, and the explanatory chain.
Yeah.
And if you do need, like you said, if you do need an active existence to explain my soul's existence, I do wonder, well, if you're going to posit something there that can just explain its own existence, darn it, like the active existence can explain its own existence, darn it.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that that feature it has, able to explain its own existence, darn it, and just move it one step closer to the thing I'm explaining. Move it from the active existence to the substantial form.
Yeah. What would you think of this? Is something I've thought about, and as I've been trying to spell out some of the details, that because I think you're right. I think that there is sort of perhaps an issue of positing individual acts of existence. But what if we thought about essay as, and maybe this will just bring up the point you're raising about relations, but as something as bearing a causal relation to God, as something about being related to God by way of God's causal activity. Would that thin it out enough, right? That we wouldn't have the regress issue, and maybe that relation is just primitive, right? That God's just causal activity. We have this causal dependence relation on God, right? And it's our being in that relation that is our individuated but not individual active existence. Sorry, it's a sketch, but
yeah, sure. So it sounds to me like there's me. There's this thing. It's my being related to God. It's not nothing because it's doing some ontological work in the story.
Yeah.
And then there's God. And necessarily for anything non-God that exists, there's another sort of schema the same. There's that thing, whatever it is. There's its relation to God, which is a real thing of being created by God. And then there's God, three real things. Now, I guess my thought is if necessarily for anything that exists that's not God, there's going to be this additional relation thing between God and that thing. I have worries about regresses again, because you have this third thing there, the connection, and I wonder what connects God to that. And if you say, no, silly, God doesn't need one of those for that. That's just connected to God. That's what it does. Then I think, oh, okay. If I have that option to add that power to a thing, just connects to God, that's what it does. I'd rather use it sooner. I'd rather not have to add the relation there in the first place.
Right. And so in your account, you would still want to say that it's the result of God's causal activity. You just wouldn't call it any sort of third thing kind of floating around there, right?
Yeah. So I wouldn't
then,
want there to be a thing there that doesn't work.
No, I'm with you on that. I think that's right. That there's not a thing, right? Yeah. So maybe we are kind of thinking about this the same way. I'll have to bring on like Gavin Kerr would be a good one to have chime in on this, right? But I don't want to chase this too much. Maybe we could get a conversation going sometime around there. But I'm very attracted to your line of thought on that of just trying to, maybe it's the minimalist in me, right? Trying to make things as slim as possible. But very good. Okay, that's cool. That's something I'm sure we'll get a lot of comments and feedback on. Yeah. This podcast is all about fun and exploring ideas, so it'll always be in good taste, I'm sure, right, gentle listeners? All right, so do you have a few more minutes, Dr. Pawl?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Because the one other thing I want to explore with you is you've done some cool work. I know it's been a while, so don't worry if you haven't totally knocked the dust off. I always hate when I have to try and do that real time myself. But you've done cool work on libertarian freedom and stuff like that. And now I'm seeing the connection with Dr. Stump. I don't know if she was an influence on you on this, but she's one of those who fancies herself a Thomist, who seems to be a pretty strong libertarian. And I'd say I've always been inclined to that view myself for many reasons. And I want to get some of your thoughts on the motivations for it, but it seems like having a pretty robust notion of libertarian freedom, it's cool because why? Well, one, it just seems true, right? So seeming there. Also seems like there's some genuinely good resources there for offering a defense to the problem of evil. And I think that philosophers, theologians who do not accept a libertarian free will sort of have at least an arm, back to your one arm scenario, tied behind their back, and maybe that can be done. Certainly people have tried it. But like anything else, I guess it's kind of like where do you want to do the work? Maybe if you accept something up front, it might be easier for a while, but then you have difficulties downstream, right? Maybe you make it a little harder up front, a little easier downstream. We see how that works in philosophy all the time. So I guess, okay, if you take libertarian freedom, you might get some things might be a little bit easier initially, like maybe dealing with problem of evil. But now we've got all these other Christian commitments we got to square, right? What about saints in heaven? They can't sin. What about Christ in the Incarnation? He couldn't sin, right? Is that compatible with libertarian freedom? I know this is a huge topic. We've only got a little bit of time,
Sure.
but I'd just be curious, any of your just sort of initial thoughts, anything you want to say about it is fine, honestly. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that Christ in the incarnation was free. I think free in a libertarian sense. I think as a Catholic and the Orthodox too, I'm required to affirm that Christ had two different wills. He had all the divine apparatus. So that includes whatever the Father and Holy Spirit use to will. That's just the divine nature on most views. But he's got a divine will there. Didn't lose that in the incarnation. And he's got a human will too. He took on a human soul and a human brain, just like my brain. And it wasn't just like for show. It was doing work. So he was thinking like I'm thinking. He was reasoning like I'm reasoning with something like this.
Right.
And I think that thing was free. Now, how do you make sense of that? Well, one thing we might say here is that, the way that Aquinas, I think, thinks about it is you have some sort of subjugation between the two wills. So that you have, the councils talk about this too. You have the human will being led by the divine will. How can it be free if it's led by? Well, led by is a pretty generous term. It can be understood in lots of different ways. So if my kid rides a bike and I run next to the kid, with my hands, they're ready to catch, but not catching. I'm not the one riding the bike. The kid is the one riding the bike. I'm just making sure the kid doesn't fall. So it could have been as minimal as that for all I know. And if that doesn't require the kid not to be really free in choosing to ride the bike or, in riding the bike. So likewise, I think the human will of Christ wouldn't have been non-free in choosing to do, in him, the person choosing through that will to do what he wants to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. How important do you think it is, again, just to make sure that we're kind of clear on what we talk about with freedom? It seems like there's two ideas of freedom in the tradition that sometimes get conflated, right? There's our freedom of choice, right, which is our ability to consider the space of reasons and make efficacious any finite motive for action that is not itself inherently determining, right? By choosing chocolate rather than vanilla ice cream, right? And we think for us, somewhere in that lies our sort of possibility for sin, maybe because our will isn't impeccable like God's for whatever metaphysical reason, stuff like that. But then there's the other freedom. We might call it moral freedom or freedom for excellence, right? And this is the sort of freedom that we attribute to like virtuous sages and stuff like that, right? That they have a sort of a certain character. And we use this language all the time, like they're free from vice or they're free from sin. But that seems not the same thing as freedom of choice. Do you think that's right? And how important is it to keep these disentangled when trying to defend a libertarian notion of freedom, right?
Well, I think of the first, I guess, as the answer to what it is. What is it to have free will?
Yeah.
And there, I think you do need some alternate possibilities, at least at some point along the way.
Sure.
If you can form yourself such that something is no longer a live option for you, then I think you're still free in not choosing that thing. Or if you form yourself such that you can't but choose something, I think you can still be free in the choosing of that, even if it's determined by your current character, provided that you had some causal role in determining that character of yours.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of openness is good for answering the question, what is this thing called freedom? I think a second question is, what's this thing called freedom for? Like, why this thing? What's its good? What's its telos? And there, I think the second answer is what we should point to. It's for the sake of goodness or virtue, or insert the noble thing. That's what it's for. So I think they're both important questions. I think you can't get rid of either one. You need an account of what the thing is. You need an account of what the thing's for, and getting rid of either one is kind of sort of ruining your account of free will in general. But I think it's more of a both and instead of an either or.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, Dr. Pawl, we've covered a lot of territory in a relatively short time, and it's really been an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you. I hope we'll be able to do it again in the future. But in the meantime, can you just let people know how they can keep up with you, your work, any new projects you're working on that you'd like to tease or mention, or anything like that?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, I'm working on a couple things now. I'm writing a book with a biologist and another philosopher. The philosopher is Michael Peterson at Asbury. The biologist is also at Asbury. And that's called Jesus and the Genome. And the basic idea is there are all these like evolution and religion debates that occur. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of those debates find fertile soil in incarnational topics. So, for instance, the how do you understand a virgin birth is something you can ask in an evolutionary sort of mindset. So, what we try to do in this book is consider some of the objections from the science and religion debate and how they apply to Christianity, especially Christology, and then answer them. That's what we're doing there, and it's pretty
Awesome.
fun. Yeah.
Do we have a tentative release date on that yet?
No, I've got a tentative get it to Cambridge date, and that's
Always good to have that, yeah.
September 1. I bet you it would be out by the following September if we get it to them at September 1. I'm also editing the Cambridge Companion to Christology, which is
great.
It's super fun. It's very exciting. I don't know if very many people that are primarily philosophers like me have edited these Cambridge Companions in theological topics, but I'm happy to be doing so, and I think it's going to be a great volume when we get it out. That is even further down the pipeline. The contributors get their stuff to me sometime in 2024. So I think it'll probably be late 2025 by the time I can hold it in my hands.
Yeah, we'll all be a little bit longer and grayer in the beard, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
But actually, that reminds me. Let me mention this one. Sorry, this virtual background makes it really hard. There, we can kind of see it.
I see it. Yeah.
The Cambridge Companion to Aquinas. If people, I guess, want a little appetizer of your work on the Incarnation, that's your contribution here. So I'll mention that. And then your book on conciliar Christology, definitely Meteor. Where's the best place for people to pick that one up, Dr. Pawl?
Oh, well, there's that thing called Amazon. I guess you could try
Feed the beast, right? Yeah.
You could do that. I've got that one from 2016. I've got a book called In Defense of Extended Conciliar Christology. The basic idea is in the In Defense of Conciliar Christology book, I take the 7 councils. I try to defend them from philosophical objections, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
In the Extended Conciliar Christology book, I take that same content and then add on some traditional views that aren't found in the councils, but are very often asserted. So that Christ was immutable. Christ was impeccable, couldn't have sinned. You don't find that in the councils, but it's a very common view through church history. So what happens when you take all the stuff from the councils, add on these additional things? Do you get a contradiction then? Spoiler, I don't think you do. So that's what that next volume in the series does. And then there's one last.
No, please put all the plugs in. That's what we're here for. Yeah.
This is the best one, I think, for people who aren't logic chopping analytic folk like me, but want to still know a bit about the Incarnation and what I think about it. There's a Cambridge Elements series. It's the book's pretty cheap, like $20, and it's pitched not for analytic philosophers. And in that Cambridge Elements book on the Incarnation that came out in 2020, I just sort of lay out what the incarnational theory is, where I think the disputes are, how I answer the fundamental problem in some more detail. So I guess that's where I'd say folks should start if they want to see it.
And that's great. I have that one. I really like the Element series. They do a really nice job with Joe's. Those are really good. A lot of cool ones. Well, again, this has been an absolute pleasure. So I will encourage you, gentle listeners, to check out all the work that we mentioned if they want to go deeper. Please comment your thoughts on anything below. Subscribe to the podcast. We'll see everybody in the next episode.
Thank you.